Here we go. Okay.
Okay, my name is Dianne Martin. Today is October the 13th, 2015, and we're here in Richardson, Texas.
Very good. Dianne, tell us a little bit about where your family originally came from and why they emigrated to South Africa, if you know.
Right, my paternal grandparents and my maternal grandparents were all from London. However, on my mother's side, they came from Lodz in Poland. And my granny she was from actually South Africa, but my grandfather's grandfather was a rabbi. And he left England in the early 1900s, came to South Africa, worked on a horse farm for a long time in Bloemfontein, where my mother was born. And he had two other daughters, and they moved to Johannesburg when my mother was a little girl. She met my father in Johannesburg, and he was from a family who actually had lived in London for many, many years. And strangely enough, they all seem to have known one another even before they emigrated, but met up again in South Africa. My mother's maiden name was Gold. My father's name was Martin, which is still my name, which I'll explain to you. My grandparents on my father's side, we think, and unfortunately my father died very young at the age of 50, he had a heart attack, but we think my grandfather, Sam Martin, the family originally were from Spain, they were Sephardic. My grandmother, and her name was Hannah Martin, Hannah Crost was her maiden name, her family were originally from Amsterdam, and she must have moved to London when she was a little girl. Unfortunately, because my father died so young, we didn't really know much about the family history, and that's kind of been lost. But my sister and I have been doing a lot of research. Mm-hmm. I was born in Pretoria, and in 1948. My sister was born earlier. She's 5 years older than I am. She actually has remained on in South Africa. Her name is Sandra. She has 3 children. We grew up in a city called Pretoria, and she married and moved to a city called Port Elizabeth, and she was there for a number of years. She married into a Jewish family. Her husband was one of a twin, and their names were Tali, Michael and Anshul Tali. Anshul has subsequently immigrated, and he lives in Denver. And they were both doctors, and their father was a doctor. Michael unfortunately died about 15 years ago, but he had remained on in Port Elizabeth. He was there forever. He never left. My sister unfortunately divorced him, moved away, and moved to Johannesburg, where 2 of her children were living. She still is there today. She's a speech pathologist, and she lives very well. 2 of her sons live in Cape Town, and they run their own business and have done extremely well in Cape Town, and her daughter lives in Johannesburg. She works for a headhunting company. But they're all still there in Johannesburg. My mother died in 1991, and I had been to America a number of times to visit, on my own and even with my daughter when she was little and growing up. We, strangely enough, had met a couple by the name of Ray and Bert Brown, who were not Jewish, but I had met them when I worked as a tour guide, because in addition to being a school teacher, and I qualified at the University of Cape Town with a BA in languages, and then went on to do a BA in honors, which is not really recognized in America, but in Canada, in classics. But I taught in South Africa until the early 1980s. I then joined the State Department, and I worked as an interpreter and a communications officer, and worked under de Klerk, the previous president, and then Nelson Mandela, who became the current president when apartheid was dismantled. Jody and I visited America a couple of times after my mother died. My mother died in 1991. And this couple, Ray and Bert Brown, lived in Dallas, Texas. And they encouraged me to come here. And through a contact that I'd had in the State Department by the name of Helen Giddings, who was a state representative, I was offered a job in Dallas. Ray and Bert, of course, encouraged this. I had a cousin living here who'd immigrated long before me, and he lived in Los Angeles, where he still lives. His name is Keith Levine. it was strange coming to Dallas because I didn't even think that there were a Jewish people living in a Texan town like Dallas. You know, I thought there were only cowboys here. And strangely, through contacts that I had, I actually met up with somebody in South Africa before I left, who's become and is still one of my dearest friends, Helena Lefton. I started meeting the Jewish community. I met the Jacobsons. I met many people who had immigrated long before me in the 70s and the 80s. Unfortunately, when we got here, the job that I thought would materialize just didn't happen. Helen Giddings literally dumped me. She wasn't really interested. I searched, I struggled, and eventually went to work at Solomon Schechter School. I was there for a year, and it wasn't a very good fit because I was a high school teacher. However, I was fluent in 5 languages, and it just wasn't for me. Fortunately, through a contact that I had in Chicago, who was a South African, I was able to secure a job and move to Chicago for a year. And I worked on the south side at a temple called Rodfeit Tzedek, which was a conservative synagogue. But my friend's name was Thea Crook, and she tried desperately to keep me there, but unfortunately they couldn't sponsor me, and that was the big question. I had to stay. And out of the blue, through a contact that I'd had here before I left Dallas, I met up with a woman called Jean Underwood at Ursuline College at school, and she offered me a job teaching part-time Latin, and I said, I can't believe they teach Latin in Texas. However, she then called me once more and she said, I went to a job fair and there's a school in Garland. I said, where's Garland? She said, it's on the outskirts of Dallas, and they're looking for a full-time Latin and English teacher. And I said, oh my goodness, I didn't realize it was that popular. And after a year, I moved back to Dallas. I was rather sad to leave Chicago because I'd made a lot of lovely friends, and I enjoyed the culture of Chicago. Mm-hmm. But Dallas was kind of home in a way because Ray and Bert were here. Not that they could do anything because they were an elderly couple, and they were just very simple people. And they had no connections in the Jewish community. And this is where I came back to. And my daughter went to school here. She grew up. She ended up at the same high school where I've been teaching for 16 years, Naaman Forest. I actually teach at 2 schools now. I teach at Naaman one day, and because there's such a dire need for a Latin teacher that they can't find in Garland, and the program has grown in leaps and bounds. I've got over 100 students taking Latin now. I teach at another school on every alternate day called Lakeview Centennial, which is on the outskirts of the Garland area. I've been living in Richardson for the last 11 years. I own this condo which I bought, and my daughter went to Texas A&M, and she has her degree in communications and marketing. She's very talented in the field of fashion, and she works a lot at the Fashion Mart downtown, and she also goes up to New York very often. She's doing a lot of work in that field. We're very close. She's a very special young lady, and 3 years ago she was very fortunate to meet a wonderful young man at the matzo ball, which she used to organize and convene. And his family, or should I say the company that his family heads now, called Glazers, were the sponsors. And she met Kyle Stein. Wasn't really interested initially, but they eventually got together, and I knew this was it. And just before, about a year later, they got engaged, moved to San Francisco, lived there for a year, and he did some work for Gallo. She worked for the Men's Warehouse, which is connected to his father, and they're now back in Dallas. They were married at a wonderful wedding last year. There were about 500 people, and people came from all over the world, including my entire family, some of whom I hadn't seen for over 20 years.
I was going to ask you if any of them had come to the States or they're still
there.
My
entire family came. Mm-hmm. You can see them over there. My sister's grandchildren couldn't come because it was during school time. She has 8 grandchildren and she's got 3 wonderful children. But my cousins came from Australia, and my cousin who lives here, he moves between Los Angeles and New York. He's quite from now, and so he was here. Friends who I had known all my life, who lived all over the United States and I've connected with in Chicago and in Salt Lake City and even in Canada, and all my sister's family on her husband's side, and in people from Boston. They came from literally all over the United States. People came from Israel, they came from Europe. A lot of my friends from South Africa couldn't come because it was just too far and too expensive, but it was one of the most special times of my life. And I can honestly say, for as much as I love Dallas and I'm very happy here and I've made wonderful friends in the Jewish community, people like the Hellers and the Jacobsons and the Leftons have been incredibly wonderful to me. And I had a very special friend by the name of Helen Newberg, who's just recently passed away.
I knew Helen.
That was like a mother to me. I'd known her for 18 years from the time I arrived here. We were as close as daughter and mother. My friends have been incredibly wonderful to me, but I do miss my family. My sister comes quite often because she's able to travel. Her sons have been here for a few times. Her daughter came for the first time last year to the wedding, and it was just amazing to have her here. I've only been back once, and I'm actually going back next year. My sister's, one of her grandsons, she's got 4 grandsons, 4 granddaughters, and they're very entrenched in Jewish life there. They all go to Jewish day schools. Her grandson, who I'm very close to, is having his bar mitzvah, and I'm going in August 2016, God willing.
Wonderful. I want to ask you a question about that. What, if anything, besides family and friends, what type of culture, customs, etc., do you possibly miss about South Africa, if anything?
I miss the warmth of the Jewish community. There was a much stronger bond between all of us, and the traditions were very much the same, but people were, maybe it was because I'd grown up with most of them, but people were very caring of you. You never sat alone on a Shabbat. You never, you were just never alone, and you could always pop in and visit people on a Sunday afternoon, which I find is a little bit different here. I wanted to just mention one other family that have really been wonderful to me since I've been here. I've only known them since I returned to Dallas in 2000, because I arrived here in 1997, went to Chicago, came back. A family by the name of Rosenberg, Shelley and Rachel Leah Rosenberg, who are also like home from home. But it's different because I'm not Orthodox, but I do spend a lot of time with them. I've just been at their son's bar mitzvah. I've been with them for all their simchas. But the thing about South Africa that I miss is just the closeness of a small community, which America doesn't have.
Have you gotten involved in Dallas, specifically in any other things in the Jewish community per se?
Well, I did join Hadassah at one stage with Helen, and I went to a number of meetings. I used to go to a lot of Jewish singles things that they organize, and I've kind of stopped doing that. I don't know why. I do the Shabbaton now, which I'm doing with a family by the name of Lurie. I think because I'm on my own, it's sometimes a little bit difficult to get involved, because I see, especially with my daughter's family, the Steins, it always seems to be couples involved. So, no, not really, but I've become very involved in international organizations. I'm a member of the World Council of International Affairs, and I've joined an organization called DFW International. I love different cultures and different nationalities, and I think that's been a part of me that's kind of, I've enjoyed here. I've also now, in the last 5 years, and it took me a long time to get my green card and my citizenship. It took me 8 years to get our green card, simply because Helen Giddings picked me up, and then she dropped me, and then I was sponsored and re-sponsored. But after 8 years, in 2008, we got our green cards through a lot of trial and tribulation, losing papers and going through lawyers and lots of expense. And then we simply had to wait 5 years later. I got my citizenship 2 and a half years ago. My daughter didn't get hers initially because I told her to wait because she was engaged at that stage. And she got her citizenship at the beginning of this year as Jodie Stein, not as Jodie Martin. So we are now fully fledged American citizens, but it took us altogether 13 years. I've also now, apart from my teaching, got very involved with a company called EF Tours. And from the time I had my green card, I've been taking students to Europe every summer. And I've done 3 trips to Italy, a trip to Greece, and a trip to London. And this year, coming year, I'm taking a group to London, Paris, and Barcelona. And in 2017, a group to Cuba. And I really enjoy that part of living here because I know living in South Africa, I could never have afforded to do it. Students were too far away to take trips of that nature. And the cost of living now and the economy is so bad down there. And that's one of the reasons I would never go back. As much as I miss my friends, that it's just inaffordable to travel for most people who don't have a lot of money at their disposal.
I'm glad to hear that at least.
Yes, but I do miss my family, and my sister and I are very close. And we share a lot about our parents because, you know, there were things that we remember so much about my grandparents, my granny, you know, making fish on a Friday and matzo ball soup, and my mother doing the same. And you miss those things that you remember about growing up, although it's the same but different. I think Jews the world over are kind of united in that we have the culture that keeps us together, even though we come from different countries.
Do you see your daughter Jodie carrying on some of the culture and customs that you had in South Africa that you've brought over here with you?
Oh yes, and in fact, even though we were always Jews first, never South Africans, where I think here you are more first Americans and then Jews. I don't know, but I get that impression that people are much more patriotic here about being American. We weren't that patriotic, particularly as we lived under a government that, you know, we knew couldn't last, and B, now the government that is just so corrupt and that we don't identify with at all. It's made Jews in South Africa more and more conscious of being Jewish and more isolated. In fact, you know, Jews have become much more religious and much more aware of Judaism than they ever were before. And I see so many of my friends who've become Orthodox that were not at all that way inclined. I think the customs that she'll keep going will be the traditions that we kept, Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur. You know, those were things that you just had in your homes, the Seder, the Pesach Seder. But she also has a lot of South African traditions that she won't let go of, which I've forgotten about, you know, things that we used to cook and things that we said and things that we did that was typically South African. I seem to have lost those. Although I still remember them, it's not that important to me anymore because I've tried to immerse myself totally in being an American.
Tell us about the siddur that's in your lap there.
Well, all I can say is I was given it at my bat mitzvah. And I don't remember very much.
So we can see. Yeah, it's a little tiny. Yeah.
I don't remember much more about it, but I've had it ever since I was 12. So it's become a little bit tarnished. And I lived in Israel for a year and a half. I went to Israel just after the 6-Day War. I was kind of very enthusiastic about going. And my mother thought I was crazy to leave home. And I spent a year and a half in Israel. I was on an Ulpan in Carmiel, which now is a huge town. It was a tiny little shtetl in those days. I met a young Czechoslovakian man from a very Orthodox home, and we were planning to get married, and my mother came over and brought me home to South Africa. She just said she didn't think it would work. And I think in a way now maybe it wouldn't have. Funny enough, he lives now in Crown Heights and is in a very Orthodox community in New York.
Was Zionism important growing up with your family?
Yes, it was, but not to the point that everybody wanted to go to Israel. But you were always very aware of being Jewish and very aware of the situation in Israel. And it's still the same now. You know, we relate to one another very easily about how we feel here and how they feel there, particularly in view of the terrible events that are going on now at the moment. And it was the same last year. They had huge rallies, just as we did. In fact, massive rallies for the safety of Israel with the situation in Gaza. So I think that Jews, no matter where you are, we have that spark that keeps us alive. And yes, I miss my family terribly. I think as I get older, it's harder. I see my daughter much more involved with her new American family, and I am rather alone. But I have good friends here, and I have a cousin who I see at least twice a year, although he's all over the country. But we talk almost every day on the phone. And now with Skype and Vonage, and I can talk to my family every week. But I do miss them. It's a long way from home.
It is. Overall, just to sum up, tell us, are you glad you're here? And if so, why?
It's a hard question because there are times that I say, yes, I am glad. There are times when I feel I'm sad that I have to leave everybody that was so close to me. But I think the opportunities that have been afforded to me and the cost of living and the way of life is a lot more affordable here. I don't know if it would have been so in other cities, because probably if I'd gone to New York I would have struggled, or I've just come back from Seattle and I found that very, very expensive. But I think generally I do have a better quality of life here and a safer quality of life. I was attacked and mugged a couple of times in South Africa, and I lived in a home on my own on a property where at the end I had all sorts of safeguards, a wall that was 6 foot high, barbed wire around the circumference of the property, burglar proofing, you name it, alarms, because we were always so nervous about going anywhere, and I was attacked a number of times. So yes, from that point I'm very happy to be here. I'm also very, very glad that I afforded my daughter the opportunity, because I don't think she would have had the education. Granted, she didn't go to a private school, but she did go to one of the best universities, I think, in America, Texas A&M, which was a state university. And she's married into a wonderful family that I don't think she would have had the opportunity to meet if she'd lived in South Africa. So yes, I think, as many Jews coming to a new country, like they probably did way back when they came from Russia, we came for the sake of our children. And even though I had one child, and I am a single parent, and I've been on my own most of my daughter's life, and I won't go into those details because he wasn't Jewish. He was a Catholic from Italy, and wasn't very family conscious. But although we are still in touch with the family, I think from the point of view of giving my daughter a better future, yes. And there still are lots of memorabilia that I have brought with me that are not typically Jewish. My mother's chair that she actually, that was her tapestry chair. I brought a lot of her furniture. I still have pictures of my parents and my family all around the house. I have a lot of mementos that my mother had in her home. So I brought virtually whatever I could that reminds me of home, but it's here on a different continent. And I hope that Jody will continue. She will keep these things. I don't think she'll let them go. And that will be given to her children as a link to where we came from.
Well, legacy is certainly very important.
It is.
Yes.
And we did have a very rich legacy in South Africa.
I thank you very much, Dianne.
Well,
wonderful interview.
All the information
Terrific.
that you needed.
Appreciate it. Thank you.
And I do get sometimes quite emotional because
All right.
when I saw my family last year,
Yeah.
they were all here. They all flew in on that week. And they were all coming in dribs and drabs. And then my sister said, she was down at the hotel where the wedding was, everything was taking place. She said, hurry up, get into the hotel. And I walked in and everybody was there. I just burst out crying.
Oh.
It was hard to see
It's
them
bittersweet, but it's wonderful.
all. It is bittersweet.
Yeah.
And I think you talk to everybody who comes here.
Mm-hmm.
Unless they've got their entire family, they'll tell you that they've had to make a new family in the United States. And these people that I've mentioned, they're all my family.
I think you'll find that that's not unique. Many people came with just a few people or no one, just clothes on their back and their spouse maybe, and that was it.
We came with 2 suitcases,
Yeah.
and I shipped a lot of the stuff over, but at least, this is home now.
Yeah.
And my daughter lives down. Are you still?
No, I'm still going.
My daughter lives down in Preston Hollow,
Mm-hmm.
and she has a magnificent home, which is very different from the way I live.
Mm-hmm.
But yes, I'm very glad that she's got that life, and it's going to be a good life for her, I think. She's into a very good family.
Yeah.
So
That's right.
I'm here, and wherever they'll bury me, I'll probably be buried here, and that will be where my remains will be. But my family and everybody is still way back there.
Okay.